Let your body settle wherever you are, and allow the quiet to carry you somewhere far away and long ago. Long before the empire stretched to every horizon, Rome was a modest city beside a slow brown river, wrapped in hills and morning mist. The Tiber moved unhurriedly through the valley, carrying silt and silence past the first wooden settlements that would one day become marble. Smoke from small hearth fires drifted upward in the still air above the Palatine Hill, where the earliest Romans kept their animals and their stories close. The laws that would one day govern millions began here, passed quietly between elders sitting in the shade of simple timber structures. In those early years, the line between law and custom was barely a whisper, and punishment was a matter settled between families and neighbors. The hills themselves seemed to hold the weight of that early world gently, their slopes terraced by hand and softened by the olive trees planted between them. Stone by stone, the Romans began to build something more permanent than their wooden homes, pressing each block into place beneath a wide Mediterranean sky. The Forum, which would one day echo with the voices of senators and merchants, was at first simply a low marshy clearing between the hills. Water was drawn from the river in clay vessels and carried uphill each morning, a slow and ordinary rhythm that shaped the hours of Roman life. The earliest Romans watched the sky carefully, reading the flight of birds and the movement of clouds to understand what the gods required of them. Their gods were everywhere in those years, living in the bend of the river, the shadow of a doorway, the hinge of the wooden gate at dusk. Even the boundaries of land were sacred, and a man who moved his neighbor's stone marker faced consequences that the community took as seriously as any crime. These early rules were not written down, passed instead through memory and repetition, recited by fathers to sons in the same patient, unhurried way season after season. And slowly, as the city grew upward from those river-bottom marshes, so too did the sense that behavior must be shaped by something larger than any single family. By the time lanterns were hung in the streets, the laws of Rome had already begun to harden into something written, deliberate, and strange by any later measure. And so we begin, gently, at the very edge of that world, before the empire, before the marble, in the quiet first hours of a civilization finding its voice. In the early days of Rome, before the city had towers or written laws, small wrongs dissolved into the morning like mist over the Tiber. The Forum was still just an open field of pale grass then, and what passed for justice was quiet, unhurried, and often forgotten. A man who took his neighbor's grain might find it returned by evening, the matter settled with a handful of salt and a slow nod. There were no prisons yet, no iron doors, only the slow turning of seasons and the memory of the village elder. A wrong committed at dusk might simply belong to the night, unrecorded, unnamed, dissolving before the roosters called the new day. The oldest Roman customs treated certain offenses the way still water absorbs a single dropped stone, with barely a ripple. A borrowed tool unreturned, a boundary stone nudged in the dark, these were the first crimes, small and soft-edged as river clay. The early Romans believed that shame, carried quietly home, was punishment enough for many of these gentle trespasses. And so the first lawgivers recorded almost nothing, trusting instead the long, slow customs passed from father to son like a wool cloak in winter. The 12 tables, when they finally came, were simply the writing down of what most Romans already knew without asking. Before those tablets, a stolen fig from a neighbor's garden was settled between families, quietly, the way a breeze settles dust on a warm road. Slowly, across generations, the Romans began to feel that some wrongs needed a name, a word carved into the world so it would not drift away. And yet even then, the very first named crimes were mild things, trespassing on sacred ground, cutting a neighbor's crops at night. The punishments too were slow and careful, weighted less like hammers and more like rain, steady, patient, absorbed over time. In those quiet centuries the line between a crime and a misunderstanding was thin as the papyrus the Romans had not yet learned to use. And so the first crimes slept quietly inside the first mornings, the way seeds sleep in cold soil, patient and still. The city would grow, and the laws would harden, but for now the world was unhurried, and the river moved slowly past fields of pale winter grass. In the ancient world, justice was often a quiet thing, moving through rooms that few people ever entered. Roman courts of the Republic held a peculiar tradition, where the men who decided fates would remain behind curtains or screens, their identities carefully kept from those they judged. The practice was not born of cruelty, but of a slow, considered logic that had grown over many generations of Roman civic life. A judge who could be seen could be pressured, approached on the street, visited at his home by powerful men who wished outcomes to bend their way. And so, in certain courts, the panel of judges sat behind a partition of wood or heavy linen, voices traveling through cloth rather than open air. The accused would speak into what must have felt like an open and quiet space, never quite certain how many ears were listening or what expressions those ears belonged to. Witnesses brought their accounts forward and let them go into that same stillness, their words received by men who gave nothing back in posture or expression. This was considered, by Roman legal thinkers of the period, a way of letting justice breathe without the weight of social hierarchy pressing down upon it. The wealthiest families in Rome commanded tremendous social gravity, and a judge who could be seen might instinctively defer without ever meaning to. Behind the screen, all voices arrived as sound alone, stripped of the fine toga, the gold ring, the particular way a senator held his shoulders. Slowly, the tradition developed its own quiet protocols, hand signals passed between judges that no one outside the partition could see or interpret. Records from the late Republic mention certain trials where no one in attendance could identify a single member of the panel when the proceedings concluded. The verdict would arrive written on a wax tablet, pass through a gap at the base of the partition, and read aloud by a clerk in a steady voice. There was something in that arrangement, the nameless voice reading an unsigned decision, that gave Roman law a quality almost like weather, present everywhere, belonging to no one. In time, the practice shifted and changed as all Roman institutions eventually did, some courts returning to open benches, others holding to the hidden panel for generations more. What remained, long after the specific courts were gone, was the idea that a face could be a kind of argument all on its own, one the law had once tried gently to set aside. And somewhere in the ruins of those old courtrooms, if you were very still, you might almost feel the quiet that gathered in those partitioned rooms, centuries ago. In ancient Rome, the law was not always written on stone or parchment, but sometimes carried on the backs of human beings. There was a particular kind of slave in Roman society whose role had nothing to do with labor in the fields or the household. These were the tabularii, the message carriers, who moved quietly through the city bearing sealed letters of legal authority. A slave assigned to legal duties occupied a strange and liminal space, bound by chains of ownership yet entrusted with the very instruments of civic power. Roman law, in its precise and elaborate structure, recognized that the apparatus of justice required hands to carry it forward. So the state, and wealthy private citizens alike, assigned slaves to witness legal transactions, hold documents, and attend court proceedings. A slave present at a legal ceremony became, in a strange sense, part of the record itself, a living seal upon a transaction. And yet these same witnesses had no legal standing of their own, their testimony could only be extracted under torture, as Roman law required. This quiet paradox sat at the very center of Roman legal life, unquestioned and unremarkable to those who lived within it. The slaves who carried legal writs through the streets of Rome moved through a world where their bodies were instruments of a law that did not protect them. In time, this arrangement became so ordinary that legal texts simply referred to the slave as part of the procedural machinery, like a seal or a wax tablet. Some slaves rose, slowly, through long service in legal households to positions of quiet trust, keeping records, organizing documents, reading letters aloud to their masters. Far away from the courts and the forums, in the quieter provinces of the empire, similar arrangements repeated themselves in smaller towns and rural estates. The law traveled with its carriers, moving slowly across the empire like something carried on a long and patient breath. There is something almost peaceful in imagining those journeys, a sealed message, a quiet road, a slave walking steadily beneath an open sky. The documents they carried have long since crumbled, and the names of those who carried them were rarely written down. And still, somewhere beneath the weight of Roman law, they walked, steady, unrecorded, carrying words that outlasted them. In the heart of ancient Rome, the Forum was a place of open air and slow-moving crowds, where life passed at an unhurried pace. Along those wide stone streets, merchants and senators alike moved through the same familiar dust, beneath the same patient sky. And yet, among them, there were those who walked with iron at their wrists, chains worn not in shadow but in full and quiet view. This was one of Rome's older practices, a form of punishment that required no dungeon, only the open air and the slow passage of people. The chains were not hidden away, they were, in a quiet sense, the entire point, a visible and deliberate part of daily civic life. A man bound in this way was not locked away from the world but returned to it, carrying his condition openly through the familiar streets. Roman law, in many of its older forms, was deeply concerned with reputation, with how a person stood in the eyes of the community. And so to wear chains publicly through the Forum was, in its own calm way, a legal and recognized expression of social consequence. The Forum itself, that broad and well-worn space, had seen many things over its long centuries of use beneath the Italian sun. Slowly, through that same space, a chained figure would move with measured steps, passing the temples and the stalls and the quiet conversations. There was a kind of gravity to it, not cruelty in the harsh sense, but a slow and public weight that the law had sanctioned. Those who passed would see and recognize, and perhaps think little of it, for it was a thing the city had always known. In time, the chained person might complete whatever period the law required, and simply continue on with the slower rhythms of ordinary life. The Forum did not pause for such things, its quiet commerce and its slow crowds moved on as they always had. And perhaps there is something gently strange about that, a city so ordered that even its punishments had their calm and lawful place in the open air. Far away in time, those stones still rest in the same warm light, patient and unhurried, carrying their long memory quietly. And the Forum, open still to the sky, holds within its worn stones the slow echo of all that once passed through it. Beneath the western slope of the Capitoline Hill in ancient Rome, there lay a place so old that even the Romans themselves had largely forgotten its origins. It was called the Tullianum, a name that drifted through centuries without anyone being entirely certain where it came from. The structure itself was modest from the outside, just a rough-hewn opening in the rock, easy to walk past without a second glance. But descending below that quiet entrance, the stone walls grew closer and the air carried the cool stillness of something very ancient indeed. The lower chamber was carved from a single piece of living rock, roughly circular, and so old it predates the Republic itself. Archaeologists believe it may have begun as a simple cistern, a place to hold water in the earliest days of the city on the Seven Hills. In time, as the city grew and its needs changed, the cistern found a quieter and altogether different purpose. The Romans began to use this deep, still chamber as a place of confinement, where those the Senate wished to hold would be lowered through a narrow opening in the ceiling. There was no door, no staircase, no way to enter or leave except through that one small opening above. The chamber itself was perhaps 4 meters across, low-ceilinged, and wrapped in the kind of silence that seems to absorb sound rather than simply allow it to pass. The stone had been worn smooth in places by time, and the walls carried the pale color of travertine and tufa laid down long before any living Roman had drawn breath. Above, the Capitoline Hill rose into the open sky, and at its crest stood the great temple of Jupiter, gleaming white against the Roman blue. The contrast between those high, gleaming things, and the quiet chamber below was one the Romans seem to have understood and perhaps even intended. To be held in the Tullianum was a legal act, sanctioned by the Senate, an official part of Roman procedure rather than an act outside the law. The structure still stands today, beneath a small chapel built centuries later, and visitors can descend the modern staircase into that same circular room. The stone is the same stone, worn and cool, and the ceiling is still low, and the opening above is still there, a circle of light in the rock. Somewhere far above, the city moves through its afternoon, and below, the old chamber simply holds its quiet, as it has for more than 2,000 years. In the long centuries of Rome, punishment did not always arrive as iron or flame, sometimes it came as absence, as quiet withdrawal. Bread, in the Roman world, was not a small thing, it was the daily measure of a person's place within the city's order. The dole of grain, the annona, flowed from state storehouses to citizens who had earned that standing, that belonging. To have bread withheld was to be told, quietly and formally, that you no longer stood among the counted. Soldiers who failed in their duty, who broke formation or abandoned a post, could face this particular sentence before any harsher one. For days, sometimes many days, a man ate only barley, the feed of animals, not the bread of citizens, while his companions ate beside him. The punishment lived not in hunger alone, but in the slow, daily visibility of being set apart from those who still belonged. A commander might decree this sentence standing before his assembled men, reading the names aloud in the ordinary tone of routine. The law recognized the withholding of grain as a formal act, written, recorded, administered through the same channels as any other civic business. There were also civilian forms, men removed from the grain lists as a consequence of civic disgrace, their names quietly erased. The erasure was not violent, it was a slow, administrative fading, a name no longer called at the storehouse gate. In a city where bread came from the state and not the field, this was a sentence that shaped every ordinary morning. Senators who fell from favor were sometimes stripped of privileges that included access to certain public provisions, a gentler exclusion, but an exclusion still. The logic of the sentence was simple and very old: belonging had to be fed, and withholding food was a way of revoking belonging. Slowly, in the ordinary rhythm of days, a man felt the sentence in his body and in the eyes of those around him. When the sentence ended, the name returned to the list, no ceremony, no announcement, just the quiet resumption of the daily portion. Far away from any particular story, the bread itself remains, the slow turning of the mill, the grain, the ordinary weight of a loaf. Far from the familiar streets of Rome, there was a place where the sea met a lonely shore in long, slow waves. The Romans called it exile, relegatio, a word that carried the weight of distance and salt air and long silences. A man sentenced to an island was not imprisoned behind bars, but simply placed at the edge of the known world and left there. The island of Pandateria, small and windswept, received some of Rome's most quietly famous exiles across the long years of the empire. Augustus himself sent his daughter Julia there, and the stillness of those shores held her for 5 long years. The wind moved through the low scrub and the dry grasses without urgency, as though time itself had agreed to slow down on that shore. There were no crowds here, no forums, no voices raised in debate, only the soft percussion of small waves against pale stone. Roman law permitted exile as a mercy, a way of removing a person from power without the finality of execution. The exile kept their life, and in some cases their property, but they lost Rome itself, which was perhaps the heavier loss. Some exiles wrote letters home in careful, measured words, describing the cold mornings and the particular quality of light on the water. Ovid, sent to the shores of the Black Sea by Augustus, wrote of the cold and the strange stars and the sound of foreign tongues around him. His poems drifted back toward Rome like boats released into a current, carrying the long quiet ache of distance. On Pandateria, the rocky paths between the cisterns and the sea would have been walked daily, slowly, in the way that exiles learn to inhabit small spaces. The island offered its own rhythm: morning light, midday heat on the stone, the long amber hour before dusk. In time the sea itself may have become a kind of companion, its slow breathing more familiar than the voices of the capital. The punishment was legal, even ancient, rooted in the Roman sense that banishment preserved dignity while still removing power. And so the island shore remained, and the wind continued its patient work, and the water carried no particular hurry at all. In ancient Rome, the law held many quiet tools for marking those who had broken its unwritten boundaries. Among these tools was one that left its record not on paper, but on skin itself, in letters of ash and iron. The practice was called stigmata, a word meaning a mark or a brand, and it was applied with quiet, bureaucratic certainty. Slaves who had fled their masters, soldiers who had abandoned their posts, those convicted of certain thefts, all were candidates for the letter. The most common mark was the letter F, pressed into the forehead, standing quietly for fugitivus, the one who had run. There was also K, for calumniator, the false accuser, a letter so old it had nearly vanished from the Latin alphabet by classical times. The branding iron was heated in a small brazier, and the moment passed in perhaps only a few seconds of stillness. Afterward, the mark remained for life, a single letter speaking without sound wherever its bearer walked. In Rome's crowded forums and narrow market streets, such a mark would have been seen and understood immediately, without a word spoken. Some bore their letters with a kind of weary acceptance, moving through the world as they always had, only now labeled. Over time the skin healed around the mark, the edges softening, the letter becoming simply part of the face, of the story. Some emperors later attempted to restrict branding on the face, preferring the hands or arms, perhaps out of something like mercy. Constantine, in the early 4th century, issued a ruling that the face should be spared, for it was made in the image of heaven. Yet the practice continued in various forms for centuries more, shifting and adapting as empires do, slowly and without announcement. The letter carved into flesh became, in its quiet way, a kind of text, a permanent document written on a living archive. And somewhere in a museum archive today, among clay tablets and bronze tablets and papyrus, those letters still wait to be read. The afternoon light falls through high windows onto old stone, and the past rests there, patient and unhurried, as it always has. Along the banks of the Tiber, where the water moved slow and brown beneath the reeds, Roman law held a particular silence for its most grave offenses. The punishment was called the pena culiae, a name that translates gently into something like the penalty of the sack. It was reserved, in the oldest traditions of Rome, for those who had killed a parent, a crime the Romans considered something almost beyond ordinary understanding. The sack itself was made of leather or heavy linen, and it was sewn carefully shut, as if great care had been taken in this final, quiet act. Inside the sack, the ancients placed a dog, a rooster, a viper, and an ape, each chosen with a deliberate and symbolic meaning now partly lost to time. The dog, the Romans wrote, was chosen because it bites without reason, and the serpent because it moves through the earth without legs, between two worlds. These were not explanations meant for courts or legal scrolls, but something older, something passed down in the way a story is passed down, quietly. When the sack was sealed, it was carried to the river, sometimes the Tiber, sometimes another river entirely, and lowered into the current. The water accepted it, as rivers accept everything eventually, without ceremony and without haste. Roman legal scholars wrote about this practice with a kind of careful distance, as though even they found it difficult to look at directly. Cicero, writing in a different age, described the punishment as something the ancestors had devised with extraordinary wisdom, meaning it was already old when he spoke of it. By the later empire, some emperors softened the practice, and at certain times the live animals were removed, and only the sack remained. There is something in that detail that is worth holding gently for a moment, the slow transformation of a law across centuries, like sediment shifting on a river floor. The Tiber still runs through Rome today, broad and unhurried, carrying the city's reflection on its surface in the early morning hours. The old stone embankments the Romans built still hold the river in place, dressed now in lichens the color of dried mustard and pale ash. Somewhere beneath those stones, the record of all those old ceremonies persists, not as memory exactly, but as the particular weight that rivers carry from one age into the next. The river does not remember the names, but the current moves in the same direction it always has, slowly, and without any particular urgency. In the ancient world, the choice of punishment was rarely left to chance, and the selection of serpents carried its own quiet, deliberate weight. Roman law, with all its careful architecture of rules and precedents, found room for the natural world to serve as instrument of judgment. Serpents were not chosen carelessly, particular species were selected with a kind of solemn intention that spoke to the seriousness of the crime being addressed. The viper, native to the Italian peninsula, wound through the undergrowth of hills outside Rome, unhurried and patient in the long grass. To the Roman mind, the serpent carried associations older than the city itself, woven into stories of gods and ancient warnings passed down through generations. The condemned would be brought to a particular place, and the air there had a stillness to it, a quiet that settled over the proceedings like morning mist. There is a record, preserved in faded Latin, of a trial in which the magistrate specified the serpent as the means of execution with the same measured tone used for any other legal matter. The leather of a sack, worn smooth at the edges, was sometimes used to hold the creature before the sentence was carried out, sealed carefully with cord. The Tiber moved slowly past the edges of the city on mornings like these, its surface pale and unhurried, reflecting the wide sky above. Some accounts suggest the sack was then lowered toward water, the serpent and the condemned sharing a brief, strange proximity before the sentence concluded. Roman legal texts are precise in their language but quiet about the experience itself, as if the stillness of the moment required no further description. Elsewhere in the empire, on the dusty roads of North Africa and the warm provinces of the East, other species were known and sometimes named in provincial records. The empire stretched across climates and terrains so different from Rome that the creatures available to provincial magistrates varied considerably from city to city. A gentle, slow consideration seems to have governed the selection, as if the law itself wished to remain in keeping with the gravity of its own language. The creature, placed carefully in the records, becomes in time less a living thing and more a notation, a word in the long sentence of Roman law. These records survive in fragments now, held in reading rooms where the afternoon light comes in slowly through tall windows and falls across the open pages. And somewhere beyond those pages, in the long quiet of centuries, the hillsides where these things occurred have grown over slowly with grass and small, unhurried flowers. Long before empires fell, the Romans built roads that stretched farther than most men would ever walk in a lifetime. Some of those roads were not built for soldiers or merchants, but for those the city had decided to send away quietly. Exile, in Rome, was often carried out on foot, along roads the punished man would walk alone, watched only by the dust rising behind him. The sentence was called acqui et ignis interdictio, a withdrawal of water and fire, the two things every home was made of. Without fire and water, a man could not be received under any Roman roof, could not warm himself at any hearth, could not draw from any public well. He simply had to walk, and Rome simply watched him go. There were no guards, most of the time, the road itself was the punishment, and the distance was the sentence. Philosophers walked these roads, and senators, and poets, men whose words had offended the wrong ears in the forum. Ovid was sent east to Tomis, on the edge of the Black Sea, a place so far from Rome it barely had a Latin name. He wrote letters home for years, poems in Latin sent back along the same roads he had walked away on, carried by strangers going the other direction. The road to exile was always heading somewhere, toward the sea, or the mountains, or the edge of a province, but it never seemed to lead back. Some men, after years away, would stop writing and simply become quiet, absorbed into whatever place had taken them in at last. The road did not remember them, it continued in both directions, carrying other feet, other stories, other silences. At the edges of the empire, where the Roman roads thinned into dirt tracks and then into nothing, the punished man found the world simply continuing. Hills that did not know his name, rivers that had never heard of Rome, fields of grain that grew without any law to govern them. And perhaps, if the road had been walked slowly enough, something in the quiet of all that distance softened into something like rest. The Romans called it punishment, but the road itself kept no such record. It lay in the sun, patient and still, as it always had. In the ancient world, salt was among the most precious of all things, carried across mountains and traded like silver. The Romans understood salt so deeply that they built a long road named for it, the Via Salaria, stretching north from the city toward the salt flats of the Adriatic coast. And because salt was so valued, to steal it was considered a serious wound against the whole community. The law, in its particular Roman thoroughness, devised a punishment that turned the very substance of the crime back upon the thief. Salt would be pressed into the open cuts left by the rod, slowly, with a kind of deliberate and ceremonial patience. The practice was not hidden or hurried, it took place before witnesses, as most Roman punishments did, in the open air of the public square. There is something almost quietly philosophical in this, that the Romans would answer a theft of salt with salt itself, completing a circle the law found satisfying. Salt at that time was not merely a seasoning, it preserved meat through long winters, kept armies fed on distant campaigns, and held a kind of life-giving weight few substances have carried since. Roman soldiers were sometimes granted a salarium, an allowance specifically meant for the purchase of salt, from which our word salary still drifts gently down through the centuries. So the thief who took salt had reached into something the whole state held dear, and the punishment reflected that weight in its quiet, methodical way. Wounds treated with salt would heal more slowly, and the Romans were fully aware of this. It was part of what made the punishment feel complete to them. The 12 tables, those earliest written Roman laws, speak of proportionality in punishment, and later jurists would spend centuries debating exactly where proportion ended and cruelty began. Salt rubbed into wounds sat somewhere in that long, slow debate, accepted by some magistrates and questioned by others, the law shifting like sea sand underfoot. Even the word salary carries its quiet ghost of that world. Every pay envelope in the modern morning still holds a trace of those salt roads and stone courts. In time, the practice faded as Roman law grew more elaborate and codified, and the later empire moved toward different forms of punishment for crimes of property. But for a long while, somewhere in the calm certainty of Roman public life, salt was both wealth and judgment, given and taken in the same white crystals. And the punishment, strange as it sounds across so many centuries, made a kind of sense to the people who lived beneath those wide Mediterranean skies. Across the ancient Roman world, certain stones were set aside not for building or for beauty, but for punishment. These were flat, broad slabs of limestone or travertine, carried to open courtyards where sentences were carried out in plain sight. Over long years, the repeated motion of punishment slowly wore the surface of these stones into something almost gentle, polished, curved, worn smooth. You can still find such stones today in the ruins of Roman forum floors, their surfaces curved like shallow bowls from centuries of use. Roman law prescribed flogging, the verberatio, as a formal legal penalty for a wide range of offenses committed by slaves and free persons alike. The instrument used was the flagellum, a short whip of leather strips, sometimes weighted, designed to leave marks without ending life. A magistrate would pronounce the number of strokes, and a lictor, an official attendant, would carry the sentence out in the forum. The lictors carried the fasces, a bundle of rods bound around an axe, which gave the punishment its weight of legal authority. What is quietly remarkable is that this was not cruelty outside the law, it was the law, written into the 12 tables and repeated across centuries. The smoothing of those stones was the slow accumulation of legal order, one sentence at a time, 1 year at a time, across generations. Visitors to Pompeii have noted that certain flat stones near the basilica show exactly this kind of gradual wearing, patient, unhurried erosion. The basilica at Pompeii was both courthouse and public hall, its columns still standing after nearly 2,000 years, pale in the morning light. Around such places the city hummed its ordinary life: bread sellers, children, the smell of bakery fires, the sound of carts on stone. And yet within steps, a sentence was being carried out, as quietly and routinely as bread was being weighed and wine was being poured. In time, the stones remembered what the people forgot, not the names, not the crimes, but the shape of the accumulated days. Those smooth hollows in the stone are among the quietest records of Roman legal life, shaped not by chisel, but by the slow passing of law itself. And now, far away from the noise of the Forum, those stones rest in the open air, warm under the sun, patient and still. Along the southern edge of Rome, the Appian Way stretches slowly into the evening, its ancient stones still warm from the afternoon sun. This road is very old, begun more than 300 years before the Common Era, and it carried armies, merchants, and pilgrims for centuries without pause. In the last light of day, the road glows a deep amber, and the cypress trees along its edge stand very still against a pale orange sky. Rome believed that punishment carried weight only when it could be witnessed, and so the Appian Way became a place where justice was made visible. Crucifixion was, in Roman law, a punishment reserved entirely for those whom the state considered beneath ordinary legal standing, slaves, rebels, and enemies of the Republic. It was considered, by Roman citizens themselves, a shameful and distant thing, something that happened far from the Forum, far from the city's marble heart. And yet in 71 BCE, in the aftermath of the slave revolt led by Spartacus, 6,000 crosses were placed along this very road. They stretched from Capua to Rome itself, roughly 200 kilometers, spaced so that a traveler would never lose sight of them. The Roman general Crassus ordered it so, and the historians of that age recorded it plainly, without ceremony or additional comment. Walking that road afterward, in the weeks and months that followed, must have been a very quiet experience, the sound of wind through dry grass, the distant caw of crows. The road continued to be used, merchants still moved their goods, families still traveled, because Roman life was practical and did not pause for long. What the crosses were meant to say was simple: order had been restored, and this is what the road that leads to Rome looks like when order returns. In time, the road carried only travelers again, and the long silence of those months slowly settled back into the ordinary rhythm of movement and commerce. Today the Appian Way still exists, much of it intact, and in the early evening the stones hold the warmth of the day just a little longer than the air around them. The tombs that line its edges are still standing too, round and crumbling, built by Roman families who wanted to be remembered by everyone who passed. There is something very settled about that old road at dusk, as if the stone itself has absorbed enough of history to be calm about all of it. And slowly the light fades, and the road grows quiet, and the old stones rest in the cooling air as they have for more than 2,000 years. Beneath the hills of Rome, far below the noise of the Forum, there lay a place that almost no one spoke of aloud. It was called the Tullianum, a name that came quietly down through the centuries, worn smooth like old stone. The structure was already old when Rome itself was young, cut from the living rock beneath the Capitoline Hill. 2 chambers, one above the other, the lower one reachable only through a narrow opening in the stone ceiling above it. It was a place where the Senate sent those they wished to forget, quietly and without ceremony. Scholars believe the lower cell was carved sometime in the 7th century before the Common Era, though the exact hands that shaped it are long unknown. The rock itself is tufa, a soft volcanic stone the color of pale sand, and it holds the cold even on warm afternoons. In the upper chamber, guards would have stood, and the air moved faintly through a small grate near the floor. Below that grate, where the light barely reached, was the lower cell, quiet and still. It is one of the oldest surviving structures in Rome, and it still stands today, visited by those who walk quietly through the old city. Over the centuries, the Romans came to call it the Mamertine, though the origin of that name drifts softly into the older layers of the language. Men who had once commanded armies were lowered into the lower cell and left there, in the quiet of the stone. Jugurtha, a king of Numidia who had long troubled the Republic, spent his last days in that lower room. The philosopher Sallust, writing not long after, noted only that the cell was damp and the smell of it heavy. What the Tullianum held was not a punishment invented in heat or anger, but one written calmly into Roman law and accepted without debate. The stone walls of the lower chamber have absorbed centuries of stillness, and today they are pale and cool to the touch. The city has grown enormous and loud above it, but the small room beneath the Senate Hill remains, unhurried and unchanged. In ancient Rome, when a man stood accused of a grave crime, the trial did not always wait for daylight to return. Torches were lit along the colonnades, their amber glow settling over the stone steps of the tribunal like a slow, warm breath. The city around them was mostly quiet, its streets emptied into the cool hours before dawn. Roman law permitted night trials under particular circumstances, and this was one of those slow, deliberate evenings where justice moved by firelight. The torch-bearers walked in a measured procession, each flame steady against the still air of the open courtyard. Senators and magistrates gathered not in haste but in the unhurried manner that Roman legal ceremony required of them. The accused stood in the center, the light of the torches falling across the carved stone floor around his feet. There was a formality to all of it, a deep and practiced slowness, as though the night itself had been invited to witness. Roman law in this era held that certain trials of public significance could be conducted after sunset with proper torchlight. The flickering light cast long, soft shapes across the marble and limestone, making the familiar spaces of the forum feel very old and very still. Witnesses spoke slowly, and the scribes recorded each word onto wax tablets balanced on their knees in the warm light. Outside, Rome breathed in its evening rhythm, distant sounds of water in stone fountains drifting softly across the rooftops. The trial moved as Roman trials moved, with citation of precedent, with measured speech, with long pauses between each declaration. Each torch was a symbol as much as it was a source of light, marking the space as one held by law and order. When the proceedings ended, the torches were carried back in the same slow procession with which they had arrived. The verdict, whatever it had been, was now part of the long record of Roman legal life, inscribed and set aside. And the forum settled back into its nighttime quiet, the stones still warm from a day already gone. In the quieter corners of the Roman forum, a scribe would settle himself onto a low stone bench, his stylus resting lightly in his hand. Before him lay a wax tablet, smooth and pale, waiting to receive the careful impressions of whatever judgment the day had brought. These tablets were everywhere in Rome, carried under arms, tucked into folds of cloth, passed between magistrates and merchants alike. A man's name pressed into wax could mean a fine, a flogging, a loss of citizenship, or simply a debt recorded and witnessed. The stylus moved slowly, deliberately, each letter formed with the same unhurried patience the city itself seemed to practice. When a sentence was complete, the wax held it there, firm and unmoving, a quiet record of what had been decided. The condemned man might never see the tablet that carried his fate, yet it would outlast him in the archives beneath the Capitoline Hill. Roman law required that sentences be written down, witnessed, and sealed, giving even punishment the weight of ceremony. There is something slow and deliberate about that act, a civilization pausing to write before it acted. The wax itself was not permanent, and scribes knew that. Another day might bring a stylus that smoothed the surface clean. But for now, in the moment of recording, the wax held every word still and certain beneath the open sky of the forum. A man found guilty of a public offense would hear his name spoken aloud, then watch a clerk write it down without ceremony. That small motion, a thin line pressed into pale wax, carried more consequence than any raised voice or drawn sword. The Romans understood that writing made things real in a way that memory alone could never quite manage. And so the tablets filled, year by slow year, carrying the careful record of what the city had done and decided. In time, wax would give way to papyrus, and papyrus to parchment, but those first slow marks were where it began. And somewhere in the long quiet of that archive, a name pressed into wax still rests, holding its sentence gently in the still air. In ancient Rome, water was not simply a comfort, it was woven into the fabric of civic life, flowing quietly through stone and time. The great aqueducts carried mountain water down into the city, filling fountains and public baths that anyone might visit on an ordinary afternoon. To be Roman, in many ways, was to live near the sound of running water, the gentle overflow of a basin, the soft murmur of a channel in a quiet street. But this closeness to water was not something every citizen could take for granted. It could, in certain circumstances, be taken away. Among the many civil penalties that Roman law permitted, one of the quieter ones was the denial of access to public water. This was not a punishment applied to criminals in the ordinary sense, it was reserved for those who had fallen from civic standing in the eyes of the law. A man who had been declared legally disgraced, what Romans called infamous, carried that status into nearly every corner of daily life. The infamous could not represent others in court, could not hold certain offices, and in some recorded cases, found the public fountains effectively closed to him. What made this particular punishment so quietly significant was how ordinary water had become in Roman life. Its absence would be felt in 100 small ways each day. A man might carry water from farther away, or purchase it, or rely on the kindness of a neighbor, but the ease of simply drawing from a public source was gone. Roman jurists wrote carefully about what access to water meant, and some of these texts survive, preserved in collections of law gathered centuries after Rome itself had changed. In those writings, water appears not merely as a resource but as something closer to a right, a benefit of belonging to the civic order. To lose that right, even quietly, was to feel the edges of one's exclusion in the most ordinary moments of the day. The Romans were, in many respects, extraordinarily precise about gradations of punishment. They distinguished carefully between the complete loss of citizenship and its partial diminishment. Denying the aqueduct's benefit sat somewhere in that middle ground, a civil consequence rather than a criminal one, a quiet exclusion rather than an open condemnation. Slowly, over the long centuries of Roman history, these distinctions softened, were rewritten, and passed into the legal traditions that would shape the world long after the aqueducts themselves had stilled. And the water itself, that mountain water carried so carefully through stone arches across the open land, continued to flow, unhurried, somewhere in the distance. In the late days of the Roman Republic, a senator's very name could be called out in the open forum and offered, quietly, for sale. It was not a punishment born of rage or spectacle, but something slower and more deliberate, woven into the fabric of Roman law itself. When a man of senatorial rank fell deeply into debt, the state could step in and declare his estate subject to public auction. The auction itself was a civil proceeding, orderly and calm, conducted in the broad daylight of the forum's open air. A magistrate would announce the senator's name aloud, and for a time, that name hung in the air above the crowd like something visible. Buyers would come forward not to purchase land or silver alone, but to acquire the debts and holdings attached to that specific Roman name. The senator himself was not present, or if he was, he stood quietly apart, watching the proceedings from a distance. What was being sold, in the most precise legal sense, was not only his property but the financial shadow his name had cast. Roman law was meticulous in this way, finding language for things most societies would prefer to leave unspoken. The Curia, where senators once debated in the careful warmth of oil lamps, stood not far from where these auctions sometimes took place. There is something very still about imagining it, the way one name echoes briefly across open stone and then settles back into silence. A senator who reached this point had often spent years in slow decline, his debts accumulating the way sediment gathers at the bottom of a quiet river. Roman society expected its senators to be wealthy, and the distance between that expectation and reality could stretch very wide indeed. After the auction, the senator's name was recorded in public registers, attached now to a legal history that would follow it through time. The register itself was a kind of monument, written in the same careful hand as treaties and census records and the names of the honored dead. In time, some senators rebuilt their standing, their names eventually receding from those lists the way water slowly draws back from stone. And the forum itself continued, as it always had, receiving the slow passage of days with the same patient indifference of very old stone. In the quieter corners of ancient Rome, there existed a punishment that left no wound, and yet was considered among the most devastating a citizen could endure. It was called the stripping of the toga, and it happened not in a dungeon, but in the open air, in full view of the city. The toga itself was more than cloth, it was the visible mark of Roman citizenship, the garment that separated a free man from one who was not. To wear it was to belong to the city, to its laws, to its long and steady order. Slowly, over the course of Roman history, the toga came to carry all of that meaning without a single word needing to be spoken. And so when the magistrate ordered a citizen's toga removed, the act itself was the sentence. The ceremony was conducted quietly, without shouting, without theater, a stillness that somehow made it weightier. Officials would gather, not to perform, but simply to witness, as though the city itself was watching through their eyes. The man who stood at the center of this ceremony was not touched roughly, the removal was slow, deliberate, almost gentle in its formality. In time, he would walk away from that place wearing a simple tunic, the garment of laborers and the poor. The tunic was not itself shameful, but the absence of the toga declared to every passerby that something had been taken. Far away from the ceremony, life in the city continued as it always had, merchants, fountains, the low murmur of the afternoon. And yet for the man who had stood in that quiet circle, the city was now a different place entirely. Some who suffered this loss were eventually restored, the toga returned after years of demonstrated character or political change. Others lived the remainder of their lives without it, moving through the same streets as before but outside the boundary that the cloth had marked. The law permitted it, the city accepted it, and no blade was ever needed to carry it out. Somewhere beneath the open sky of that old city, the silence after the ceremony must have been very deep indeed. In the ancient city, the sacred fire of Vesta burned without pause, its light constant through the long hours of judgment and deliberation. The Vestal virgins tended the flame with slow, practiced movements, their white robes catching the amber glow as verdicts were handed down in the forum below. Roman law moved at its own unhurried pace, and while courts deliberated for days, the fire in the temple never wavered. A man found guilty of certain crimes might walk free for one more night, because the law required the flame to witness the morning of his sentence. This small ritual pause, a single night between verdict and punishment, was written into law as carefully as anything else Rome ever codified. The fire, tended since before the Republic, carried a kind of institutional memory that no single magistrate could override. Slowly, across centuries, the connection between fire and civic order became so deeply embedded that Romans simply accepted it as part of how justice worked. There were punishments so precisely timed that executioners were required to wait for the vestals to confirm the flame still burned before proceeding. In time, this became less a ceremony and more simply the way things were done, as natural and unremarkable as the turning of the seasons. Far away from the courts, in the quieter streets of the city, ordinary people understood that some processes could not be hurried. The condemned might spend that final night in a room where a small lamp was left burning, a last quiet courtesy granted by the law itself. Morning came slowly over the 7 hills, and with it the official confirmation that the sacred fire had endured through the hours of darkness. Slowly the city would stir, and the machinery of Roman justice, never especially swift, would resume its patient work. The flame itself was never presented as dramatic or sacred in those moments, but simply as necessary, the way light is necessary to read a document. In time, the Vestal fire became one of those things Romans pointed to when explaining what made their civilization feel permanent and ordered. The punishments varied widely, from fines to exile to more severe consequences, but all of them waited, equally, for the fire to confirm the new day. And so the fires kept burning, steady and unhurried, through every verdict the city ever handed down, outlasting many of the laws they were meant to witness. In the ancient world, coins were not merely money, they were objects of trust, stamped with the face of an emperor and passed from hand to hand across a vast empire. When a Roman citizen was found guilty of debasing those coins, shaving their edges, mixing cheaper metals into the alloy, the punishment was designed to mirror the crime itself. The coins they had corrupted would be gathered, melted slowly in a furnace, and the molten metal poured out, not as currency, but as shapeless, worthless liquid. There is something quietly final about metal returning to its most shapeless form, all that careful minting undone in a few slow, glowing moments. Roman mints were solemn places, filled with the steady rhythm of hammers and the faint smell of heated bronze carried on still air. Each coin struck there held the authority of Rome itself, the face of the emperor pressed deep into metal, an image meant to travel farther than any army could march. To tamper with that image, to file away silver and replace it with tin, was considered an offense not just against commerce but against the dignity of the state. The punishment was codified under Roman law, the Lex Cornelia de Falsis, a statute that addressed forgery and falsification in all its many quiet forms. Slowly, a judicial process would unfold, witnesses called, evidence examined, and the fate of the accused weighed against the standards Rome held with great seriousness. For the convicted, the sentence of melting down their fraudulent coins was both practical and symbolic, removing the counterfeit from circulation while marking the wrong as seen and judged. In a quiet Roman workshop, a furnace would be stoked, and the gathered coins placed carefully inside, their images softening and dissolving as the heat slowly rose. The metal pooled at the bottom, losing all its fine detail, the emperor's profile, the laurel wreath, the careful lettering, all of it gone, dissolved back into plain matter. What was left was a simple ingot, unnamed, unranked, worth only the weight of the metal itself, a long way from the authority it had once carried. In the long afternoons of the Roman world, such proceedings would have been witnessed quietly, recorded by a clerk, and then life would have moved on around them as it always did. The coins that circulated afterward were trusted ones, clean metal, honest weight, bearing faces and inscriptions that had not been touched by a fraudulent hand. Somewhere far away, in a market in Carthage or a port in Alexandria, a merchant would have accepted one of those coins without a second thought, never knowing the care that had gone into keeping it honest. And so the day would settle, the furnace cool, the ingot stored, and the quiet work of maintaining order in a very large and very old world would simply continue, as it always had. In ancient Rome, to be denied entry to a temple was not merely an inconvenience, but a quiet and lasting form of exile from the sacred. The temple stood at the center of Roman life, open doors a sign that a citizen still belonged to the community of the honored. When the doors were closed against someone, the whole city knew, and the silence around that person grew very still. The Romans called this kind of exclusion infamia, a word that settled over a person slowly, like dust over an abandoned threshold. Certain crimes, or even certain professions, could bring this quiet dishonor without any formal trial or spoken verdict. Actors, those who had been declared bankrupt, and those convicted of particular disgraces each found themselves unable to approach the sacred precincts. They could walk the same streets, eat in the same markets, speak in the same language, but they could not cross certain thresholds. The Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill was perhaps the most imposing of these closed places, its columns rising into a pale blue sky. For a Roman citizen, to be barred from Jupiter's sanctuary was to stand at the edge of what it meant to be Roman at all. Smaller temples throughout the city held their own particular exclusions, each one a different kind of quiet refusal. The Temple of Vesta, tended always by the Vestal Virgins, was closed to the dishonored in ways that carried a particular weight. Vesta's flame burned continuously inside, and those excluded from her temple were, in a quiet sense, cut off from the warmth of the city's hearth. There were no guards posted at these doors to turn the dishonored away. The social weight of infamia was enough. A person carrying infamia simply did not approach, because the eyes of neighbors and citizens carried the same force as any locked door. In time, some of those who had been dishonored found quiet paths back, through service, through silence, through the slow passage of years. The temples waited, as stone things do, unhurried and patient, holding their thresholds open to those who would one day be permitted to return. And the city moved quietly around all of it, the honored and the dishonored alike breathing the same still Roman air. Somewhere beneath the oldest quarters of Rome, stone wells still hold the silence of centuries within their walls. These were not wells for water, exactly, though water did gather at their depths in the cool stillness below ground. They served another purpose, quieter and harder to name, in a city where law and ritual were woven into every stone. In certain corners of the city, when a man had something to confess, he would be brought to a well and made to speak downward into it. The words would fall from his mouth, down through the cool air of the shaft, and disappear into the water far below. It was believed, in the slow and earnest faith of that time, that what entered the well could not return to trouble the living world. The confession was not recorded by a scribe, not read aloud in a hall, not witnessed by a crowd of faces. It was swallowed by the earth itself, received in silence, and that silence was considered a kind of mercy. The practice was one thread in a larger fabric of Roman legal life, where punishment and ritual were never entirely separate things. To confess into a well was to offer the words to something older than law, something the Romans simply called the deep. Some wells were dedicated to this purpose alone, their openings worn smooth by hands steadying themselves at the edge. A man might stand there for a long time before speaking, listening to the faint echo of his own breath returning to him. In time the Romans came to see these confessions as binding in a way that courts and witnesses could not fully replicate. What had gone into the well was settled, complete, released from the careful balance of accusation and defense. The wells themselves have mostly been sealed now, covered over by newer streets and the slow accumulation of the city above them. But somewhere, very far below the modern pavement, those words are still held in the cool and patient dark of the water. And the wells keep their silence, as they always have, asking nothing in return for what they were given. Somewhere in the quiet heart of Rome, a stone tablet rested in the forum, worn smooth by centuries of passing hands. The 12 Tables, Rome's earliest written laws, were carved sometime around 450 years before the Common Era. Before they existed, the law lived only in memory, held quietly by a small group of men who interpreted it as they wished. Ordinary people could not know what rules governed them, or what punishment might quietly follow an unknowing mistake. And so, slowly, a group of 10 men was appointed to gather the law and press it into something anyone could read. They called themselves the Decemviri, and for a time they held all power in Rome while they worked. The tablets they produced covered debt, property, inheritance, and the quiet rituals of burial and mourning. Some of the rules seem strange to modern ears, gently echoing a world where the line between custom and law was very thin. A creditor could, under certain conditions, divide a debtor's property among themselves in a very literal and solemn way. Trees that overhang a neighbor's land were to be pruned back to 15 feet, a quiet rule about what belongs to whom. The law of the night was written gently too. A thief caught after dark was treated differently than one caught in daylight. Slowly, as the tablets were set in the Forum, ordinary Romans could walk past and read the law for themselves for the first time. Children were made to memorize the 12 tables the way one might memorize a song, slow and repeated until it settled in. Cicero, writing centuries later, recalled learning the tables as a boy, their old Latin still familiar and steady in his memory. The original bronze tablets were eventually lost, perhaps melted down during the long sack of Rome by the Gauls. What remains now are fragments, quoted in old texts, like pressed flowers held between the pages of a very old book. And somewhere in that long quiet history, the simple act of writing the law down changed what it meant to live inside it. In ancient Rome, a man who could not repay his debts did not simply owe money, he carried that debt upon his very body. The Roman state had a quiet, deliberate way of marking those who had fallen into financial ruin, and that mark was made of iron. A debtor, once formally declared insolvent before a magistrate, could be compelled to wear a ring of iron upon his finger. It was not a punishment of pain, but of visibility, a slow, constant declaration worn through the streets of the city each day. Roman citizens wore gold rings to signal their rank. The iron ring spoke a different language entirely, one of obligation and constraint. In the Forum, in the marketplace, at the baths, the iron ring was visible to anyone who happened to glance at a man's hand. There was no need for a herald or an announcement. The ring announced itself, quietly, in every ordinary moment of daily life. Slowly, over time, the weight of that small iron band became something a man felt not just on his finger but in the way others looked at him. Roman law was precise about what a debtor could and could not do while bearing that mark. Certain offices were closed, certain dignity suspended. A man could not sit in the seats reserved for equestrians at the theater. The iron ring placed him, visibly, among those of diminished standing. The Romans understood that public life was a kind of continuous performance, and the iron ring altered what role a man was permitted to play. In time, some men paid their debts and had the ring removed. The iron was gone, but the memory of it lingered in a city that had seen everything. Others carried it longer, through seasons, through years, the iron slowly worn smooth by the ordinary passage of days. The Romans did not see this as cruelty. Debt, in their understanding, was a moral condition as much as a financial one. And so the law gave debt a shape, a texture, something that could be seen and felt and slowly understood by anyone nearby. Far away from the noise of the Forum, in quieter streets near the edge of the city, men in iron rings went about their lives in ordinary stillness. The city moved around them, unhurried, vast, and the iron ring caught the light for a moment and then was still again. Somewhere in the quieter corners of ancient Rome, a small clay seal was pressed gently into soft wax, leaving behind a perfect impression. The seal belonged to an official whose name has mostly faded, yet the impression it left survived in the dust of collapsed archives. To press a seal in Rome was a quiet act of authority, no louder than a breath drawn slowly in a still room. The carved face of the seal might show a small animal, a profile of a god, or simply a pattern of interlocking lines worn smooth by many hands. These objects traveled with their owners everywhere, tied by a cord around the wrist or tucked inside a fold of cloth. When a document needed to be closed and certified, the seal was warmed slightly and pressed with steady, unhurried care. The skin of the impression, the fine texture left by the carved stone, held, sometimes for centuries, every tiny scratch on the original seal face. Scholars who study these impressions can trace the life of a single seal across dozens of documents, watching it age and chip very slowly over years. There is something quietly astonishing in the idea that a mark made in a moment of ordinary Roman business has outlasted the entire civilization that made it. Some impressions were found still attached to papyrus scrolls, the scroll long dissolved, yet the small clay cap of the seal perfectly intact. The laws surrounding the use of seals were careful and specific, because a false impression was considered one of the most serious offenses a Roman citizen could commit. To forge a seal was to forge an identity, to claim authority that belonged to someone else entirely, and Roman courts treated it accordingly. The punishment for seal forgery under Roman law was severe and carefully prescribed, yet the act itself was so quiet, so invisible, just a small impression in soft wax. A single seal impression, so delicate it could be damaged by a passing breath, carried within it the full weight of Roman legal authority. In time, the great archives of Rome fell silent, their shelves of sealed documents turning slowly back into the earth from which the clay had come. What remains now are only these small skins of impressions, scattered across museum drawers, each one a quiet surface that once touched something important. And somewhere in the stillness of that ancient moment, a hand pressed down, held gently, then slowly lifted away. In the quieter parts of ancient Rome, a column of smoke rising above the rooftops was enough to tell the whole neighborhood something had changed forever. When a citizen was condemned under Roman law, the authorities did not always need to act with their own hands. The condemned house itself became part of the sentence, and its destruction was a slow, deliberate act written into the law. Neighbors would have watched from their doorways as the smoke began to climb, thin at first, then wider against the pale morning sky. The house was not merely demolished, it was erased, its very ground salted or left permanently empty as a mark of disgrace. Roman law had a concept called damnatio, a kind of social and physical annihilation that extended even to the stones of a person's home. The smoke rising from such a house carried with it something more than ash, it carried the end of a name, the end of a family's place in the city. Children in the neighborhood would have grown up knowing that the empty lot had once been a home, though no one was supposed to say whose. There is something very still about an empty space where a building once stood, the kind of stillness that settles in slowly over years. Roman architects knew the city so well that they could look at a gap in a row of houses and understand, without being told, what had happened there. The law treated the condemned house as an extension of the condemned person, and so its removal was as formal and deliberate as any courtroom verdict. Smoke, in that world, was not merely the result of fire, it was a kind of public announcement, written in the air above the city. The neighbors who witnessed it would have understood the language of that smoke without needing anyone to explain it. By the time the smoke thinned and the air cleared, what remained was simply ground, bare, open, and deliberately kept that way. Later travelers passing through Rome sometimes noticed these empty lots and asked about them, and the answer was always careful and brief. The city remembered, even when the people tried to forget, and the ground held its quiet record long after the smoke had drifted away. And somewhere in the still air above that empty lot, the memory of a house remained, not in stone, not in ash, but in the careful silence the city kept around that place. In the ancient city of Rome, even the act of feeding a prisoner was governed by law, measured carefully, grain by grain. The law did not ignore those held within the stone walls of the carcer, it simply counted what they were owed with quiet precision. A measured portion of grain, not generous, not cruel, just enough to keep a body present in the world for another day. The Romans believed that even punishment carried obligation, and that obligation extended to the most basic sustenance of the condemned. There was something almost formal about it, the way a jailer might carry the small clay vessel down stone steps each morning without ceremony. The carcer, Rome's oldest and most enduring prison, sat quietly beneath the main roads, its ceiling low, its air still and close. Prisoners awaiting judgment might spend days or weeks in that cool dimness, sustained only by what the law prescribed. The grain ration was not charity, it was codified, a line in the legal record that said this person is still owed life until the sentence is carried out. Across the city above, the markets would be opening slowly in the early morning, baskets of grain and lentils carried through arched doorways. And somewhere below all of that movement and commerce, a person sat in stillness, waiting, holding the small weight of the day's portion. There is something quietly humanizing in this detail, that the empire which could order death still paused to ensure the dying were fed. The grain itself would have been coarse, perhaps barley rather than wheat, the kind ground roughly and dissolved in water to make a thin porridge. It would have been warm, perhaps, on cold mornings, the steam rising slowly from the bowl in that still underground air. The prisoner would have known the sound of footsteps on the stairs, the small ritual that meant another day had begun. There is no record of whether they were grateful, or resigned, or simply present with the grain in their hands and the silence around them. The law moved on, the sentences were carried out or commuted, the carcer received new occupants and fed them too, in the same measured way. And the grain that sustained them through those waiting days became, in its small way, a record of how a civilization understood even the most difficult obligations.